Okay, so I'm out camping again. You might hear some background noise because I'm in our camper. It's a pop-up camper on the back of as you can see, it's kind of small, cozy, in the back of Wayne's diesel, big old Ford truck. But they're outside around the campsite talking, so I'm trying to talk loud enough that you won't hear the background noise. So what I brought with me to start so that I would have immediate content for you guys, the magnum opus. Look how big this thing is. Radicals for Capitalism by Brian Dougherty, who I found out used to be married to Angela Keaton, who I want to get on my show, and I keep forgetting to ask. And I see Brian at all kinds of libertarian events, because he's with Reason, as I said. So let's just do an overview here. See how many pages this is. With index, 741 pages. Let me see how many times the Libertarian Party is indexed in here. Oh, quite a bit. More towards the end. It seems like beginning around page 400. This is a historical work. As the cover says, a freewheeling history of the modern American libertarian movement. So these are the seeds from which our saplings sprung, dear readers. So it is, and Brian Dougherty also wrote This is Burning Man. I think I'd like to read that. I've got like a little camera strap here where I put on my body cam for out here, you know, filming our camping trip. It's kind of getting in the way a little bit. I want to see when this was initially published. You know, we like doing this when we first start examining a book. And I learned this like examination of a book, of touching it and doing. If you've ever read, I can't remember who wrote it, but it's called How to Read a Book. And there's joke parody books that come out called How to Read Your Second Book or How to Read Another Book. But actually, How to Read a Book is a really, really good book on how to read a book. It was required reading in high school for me. So my version is copyright 2007, but it came out earlier than that, I think. Maybe not. And it was dedicated to Angela Keaton. It's his freedom fighter wife. Apparently, they got divorced not much long after 2007. There's 9 chapters and an epilogue. The chapters average, looks about 80 pages. There's one, though, that's nearly 100 pages. So, let's read the chapter titles here. So we have Introduction, Reviving an American Radical Tradition. Chapter 1, Patriots, Unterrified Jeffersonians and Superfluous Men. Chapter 2, Austrian Roadblocks on the Road to Serfdom. Chapter 3, The Three Furies of Libertarianism. Ooh, that one really intrigues me. Chapter 4, Fighting for the Freedom Philosophy. Chapter 5, Objectivism, Anarcho-Capitalism, and the Effects of Psychedelics on Faith and Freedom. Chapter 6, The Goldwater Movement, The Objectivist Crack Up, and the Hippies of the Right. Chapter 7, Libertarian Zionism, The Koch Bubble, or Koch brothers? I never know, it's Koch, right? The Koch Bubble, and America's Third Largest Party, beginning on page 389. So I said the references to the LP were around page 400. Chapter 8, a mainstreamed radicalism. Chapter 9, the twilight of the libertarian gods. That's sad. And epilogue, an eternal revolution. And then there's notes, bibliography, acknowledgments, and index. All right. So now that we've done the little perusal, we're going to start with the introduction here. Reviving an American Radical Tradition. Now, I was highlighting like crazy. Which, of course, as usual, we're going to discuss what I highlight. A group of intellectuals and activists had long seen the need for an escape route from the Social Security system and had offered a solution 2 decades before most American politicians or citizens realized that a crisis was coming. The Cato Institute was a think tank for libertarian intellectuals and publicists, named after a pair of American Revolutionary-era pamphleteers who wrote of inalienable rights and human liberty under the pseudonym Cato, an act of anonymous political speech. Also, here's what's interesting, also now largely restricted by modern government under the guise of campaign finance laws. Anonymous political speech, never really thought about it, is almost verboten today by law. Another program central to Western government had essentially died in the waning years of the previous century. The notion of welfare as a permanent entitlement, the idea and practice that it was the state's obligation to take care of and manage the lives of the poor, had been replaced by short-term assistance with work requirements. The new regime in welfare, shepherded by Democratic President Bill Clinton, seemed tailor-made to answer critiques by scholar Charles Murray in his influential 1984 book, Losing Ground. In 1997, Murray wrote a book that laid out the intellectual roots of his successful critique of the welfare state, What It Means to Be a Libertarian, both books that I'm not familiar with. And then it briefly mentions how this led to America's third largest political party, which is of particular interest to us, and notes its eventual goals include the abolition of all drug laws, not just those against currently illegal narcotics and hallucinogens, but an end to prescription laws and the Food and Drug Administration as well. That's not often brought up. Most people think we're only talking about narcotics. We are not. The abolition of the income tax. I wish he had said, because it says its eventual goals. Abolition of income tax is actually considered a short-term goal. The party's eventual goal is the abolition of all involuntary taxation. The abolition of all regulation of private sexual relations, from marriage to prostitution and everything in between. An end to public ownership and regulation of the airwaves. An end to overseas military bases and all war-making not in direct defense of the homeland, an end to the welfare state, and an end to any legal restrictions whatsoever on speech and expression. Libertarians' policy prescriptions are based on a simple idea with very complicated repercussions. Government, if it has any purpose at all, and many libertarians doubt it does. I'm going to jump ahead here for a second just in what I'm saying. This book does not shy away from rooting American libertarianism in past anarchism. Should be restricted to the protection of its citizens' persons and property against direct violence and theft. In their eyes, most government functions, if done by private individuals, would be seen as violence and theft. And that is a point I think we need to still keep making. To me, that's the most powerful entry into the normie mind. Which, unless we were sprung out of the room libertarians, most of us at one point had. I only know 2 second-generation libertarians. One of them has completely gone off the rails, Nick Sarwark, and Avins O'Brien, who is as solid a libertarian as they come. It sells the promise of a world mankind hasn't yet fully known. One with personal liberty limited only by preventing damage to other people or their property. It's a world that would be freer, richer, and even cleaner. This book tells the libertarian's story and functions as a shadow ideological history of the 20th century. While the world has undoubtedly turned in some ways in a more libertarian direction, and in some ways directly because of the thinkers and activists whose story this book tells, in many ways the libertarian movement remains a radical underground whose true influence is yet to come. From your lips to God's ears. Libertarians believe either or both that people have a right to be mostly left alone to conduct their own affairs, insomuch as they don't harm others, or that things will on balance work out best for everyone if they are. So this is political libertarianism, which can be based upon natural rights ontological or deontological libertarianism, philosophical libertarianism, or philosophical utilitarianism. Very, very important distinction to make. Utilitarians can be political libertarians, but they are not philosophical libertarians. And most in our political activism make use of both arguments, even if we, like for instance, I'm hardcore deontological. But I will make utilitarian arguments even though that's not what I ground my philosophy on, because I find it would be a really strange and warped world if doing what was honoring to rights led to bad outcomes. So I see no essential conflict, real working out conflict between libertarianism and utilitarianism. Some libertarian thinkers claim to rely more on freedom's good consequences in judging it right, and some rely on a more purely moral argument about rights and justice. In fact, and I said this, I forgot that I highlighted that it said this. In fact, most of them rely on a combination, sometimes smooth and sometimes rough, of both ideas, since their vision of rights tends to be rooted in what is best for human flourishing. Rights and consequences get linked then in a happy congruence, which is actually one of the Radical Caucus's key points, which are natural rights are utilitarian. So it's going back in time. Liberalism in the 19th century meant simply the movement toward greater liberty. In the 20th century, liberalism has come to mean the expansion of state power in the pursuit of perceived social welfare, not necessarily liberation of the individual from outside control. The ideas and those who advocate them, which in the 19th century would have been known as liberal, are now classical liberal. We need to even the quote-unquote today's liberals, the modern liberals, don't want the term. They're calling themselves progressives. They're abandoning the term liberal. Let's take it back. And I like this aside. For those who don't see the power of men with guns behind every law, libertarians say just wait and see what ultimately happens if you refuse to obey one, even the most picayune one. And Jordan Peterson made this point really clear when he said what he was opposing was an enforced speech code. And they're saying, well, it's not really enforced. You just get a fine. And he goes, well, what happens if I don't pay the fine? You got to ask the question. You have to say the quiet part out loud, as they say. Rather than creating a world of atomistic individuals, as its enemies have predicted accusingly, these classical liberal ideas have created a world in which networks of trust and interdependence are omnipresent and worldwide. This is somewhat the weird internal contradiction, but I actually don't think it is when you dig deeper. Because we all can't provide everything we need, particularly in a modern world. It's going to create, I think, an even more human interconnectedness. Libertarianism qua libertarianism has mostly failed to garner extended attention in American political and ideological history. One reason for this is the complicated overlaps, both intellectual and institutional, between it and better known and more successful right-wing conservatism. Modern American conservatism was constituted from three often warring tendencies in its formative years in the 1950s. Traditionalism, often religious with strong European and Catholic strains, sometimes rabid anti-communism and cold warriorism, usually cheer-led by ex-communists, and anti-state libertarianism. However, libertarianism remained only a tendency within the modern conservative right, and never the dominant one. Traditionalism, anti-communism, and then fealty to a Republican Party that was seen as the right's standard bearer in real-world politics has almost always overwhelmed the libertarianism. You can't escape that libertarianism came from the American right. Sorry, you just can't. 5 thinkers form the spine of this story this book tells. Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Ayn Rand, Murray Rothbard, and Milton Friedman. 4 Jews, 1 Catholic, 4 economists, 1 novelist, 4 minarchists, 1 anarchist, 2 native-born Americans, 3 immigrants, 2 Nobel Prize winners, and 3 who remained not only aloof from most professional and intellectual accolades, but generated a heated hostility from cultural gatekeepers. 3 best-selling authors and 2 secret influences. 4 men and 1 woman. So I'm just going to touch on some of the highlights. Those are all thinkers we are very familiar with. It says Ayn Rand is the most influential libertarian of the 20th century to the public at large. She is a cultural force of impressive heft. A 1991 Joint Library of Congress Book of the Month Club poll found her magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged, to be the second most influential book on Americans' lives after the Bible. That is just tremendous. Yet her status within and relationship to the movement she was essential to spawning is a paradox. A is A, Aristotle taught us. And Rand reminded us relentlessly. But the culturally immense libertarian novelist and philosopher would remind anyone who asked that she was not a libertarian. In fact, she disdained them more fiercely than most of her other and many ideological foes, calling them her avowed enemies, which is just so weird to me. She had a nasty streak. Let's just be real. Her devoted official followers have continued this tradition. More libertarian movement activists and devotees consider her more integral to their intellectual and ideological development than any other thinker. Yet Rand stood intentionally and profoundly or proudly aloof from the movement that would not exist in anywhere near its current size and strength without her. And we do have to admit that as well. We sprung from the womb of Ayn Rand. That brought up a picture I didn't really like. But we did. So Ayn Rand insisted that a philosophical system must be one airtight, unified structure, and generally had contempt for those who reached the same conclusions as she without the same base. Looking for where I stuck my phone. I keep misplacing my phone. I just had it. Well, shit, I don't know where I put it now. Wayne's going to be like, God damn it, you just had it. It's got to be in here somewhere. Sorry. Very distracted. Yet while Rand is the libertarian figure with the highest profile outside the movement, Rothbard is the major libertarian who a typical American layperson or academic is least likely to know about. He is, though, the most uniquely and characteristically libertarian of libertarians, the one whose influence explains most about what makes the ideas, behavior, and general flavor of American libertarianism unique, the most illustrative and paradigmatic of the foundational figures of modern libertarianism. Rothbard strove to create, in his own words, a thorough and systematic theory of liberty, and I believe he succeeded. Rothbard was the most radical exponent of an anarchism that was latent in many of the important figures of the 1940s and 1950s libertarianism, even though none of them dared speak its name, not even Rothbard at first. And I get it. I remember when I began my fall into anarchism. That was the last thing I wanted to be. The word tasted gross on my tongue. Scary. Nobody wants to be a minority. No one wants to be a minority within a minority movement. No one wants to be the scorned amongst the other scorned. While to many, both libertarian and non-libertarian, libertarian means a dedication to a small government, a night watchman state in the popular formulation, one restricted to the protection of citizens' life, liberty, and property, limited for the most part to the police and court functions, Rothbard advocated a fully anarchist libertarianism. He argued that even the functions of defense and courts could and should be provided through voluntary transactions in a free and competitive market. Milton Friedman is a figure of world historical importance, the American libertarian who will clearly be recognized as one of the most important intellectuals of the 20th century. Friedman is a remarkable example of radicalism in action, a hardcore libertarian who has never been shy about end goals that are still far in the future, while ideologically entrepreneuring politically achievable steps that will, probably, lead further in the direction he seeks. He doesn't have that reputation amongst radicals I know, as being shy, as being not shy about his end goals. He's viewed somewhat as a sellout. And because of that, I think I've been kind of tainted from examining him, and I probably should, and not be influenced by the opinions of friends and the like. But as much as it is economic, moral, and political, the most significant thing about libertarianism, the element that distinguishes its unique place in American thought, is that it is radical. Bingo. And those of you who are embarrassed by that today, perhaps this isn't the movement for you. And that's the kindest thing I can say. Libertarianism is radical. Your attempts to de-radicalize it will fail. Both by the very nature of what it is, and by the people who see it for what it is, who you will not silence. Of course, I doubt anyone in my patrons is the you I'm referring to. I'm referring to the universal you. It is a uniquely American radicalism whose goals can be described in many ways. Libertarians are radicals for liberty. They are radicals for choice. But a phrase first used by Ayn Rand characterizes the movement's prickliness and its willingness to take on terms from their enemies and turn them to their own advantage. Libertarians are radicals for capitalism. You left libertarians today who try to divorce this idea from our history are lying about history. Now, you could be trying to change the future of libertarianism because movements change. And that, I never deny anyone that right. But you cannot rewrite the history of American libertarianism. Radicals for capitalism. So chapter 1, he's going to now give an overview of what the chapters do, which is helpful. Chapter 1 will explain aspects of the intellectual roots of modern American libertarianism and pre-revolutionary Whig radicalism in England. Chapter 2 will discuss the early careers and radical free market economics of the Austrian school, a dominant intellectual influence on modern American libertarianism, but not the only one. The Chicago school, with Milton Friedman, its most famous exponent. I don't use that word exponent nearly enough. I usually say proponent, but I like exponent. Chapter 3 will introduce the three founding mothers of libertarianism. Is that the three Furies? Rose Wilder Lane, Isabel Patterson, and Ayn Rand, independent and fierce women creating a fresh ideological tradition with some tools from a dying classical liberalism. Chapter 4, the institutional history of modern libertarianism proper, begins with the foundation of the first modern Libertarian Education Institution, the Foundation for Economic Education. Chapter 5 discusses the anarchist strain in the modern movement and the rise of Ayn Rand's objectivist movement. Chapter 6 tells of the triumphs and travails of the movement during the 1960s, when squads of radical youngsters embraced libertarianism, only to be condemned by their heroine Ayn Rand as hippies of the right. Chapter 7 discusses the rise of the Libertarian Party and the entry into the movement of billionaire fundraiser Charles Koch and the after effects of that sudden injection of cash. Chapter 8 relates the story of libertarianism in the Reagan and Gingrich eras and beyond, and limns its influence on philosophy, culture, economics, and even psychiatry. Chapter 9 discusses the final days of the major libertarian heroes, and the epilogue assesses the controversies and prospects for this set of ideas now and in the future. And Brian states, like obscenity, libertarianism is something I know it when I see it, and other libertarians feel the same way. I like this. I just highlighted a stray sentence a bit later. Libertarians are a contentious lot, which is a sentiment I think that's come out of nearly all of our mouths. For all of its occasionally zany radicalism, libertarianism is not a utopian ideology. More than any other set of political ideals, it recognizes and is based in the limits that economic reality and human nature place on attempts to use the state to accomplish grand goals. It instead places its restricted faith in the predictable and unplanned consequences of the individual decisions of free men and women. Libertarianism is deeply rooted in the impulses of America's founding and could easily be seen as its apotheosis and fulfillment. We live in a world with citizens riven over issues that almost always come down to angry debate over government action, issues in which much of the conflict would disappear if government action were removed from the table. From immigration policy to public schools, to entitlements to value wars in the public square, to abortion to war. And that world, the ideas promulgated by the people and institutions whose story this book tells, may seem a reasonable and achievable basis for a conceivable next American revolution. And I said this on Safe Spaces. I don't believe libertarians should be culture warriors. I think that is obfuscating. There's my phone. The real issue. It's the state. If we weren't all grappling for the state gun, none of these would matter. Freedom of association would solve it. If there wasn't the prospect of the sanitized and legitimized use of force to make others all conform to our preferred vision, we could all win. Next up, Chapter 1.